Hey, so good evening, guys. Hey, I've got to go a little bit early today. I have a strategy session that I have to run later tonight with a planning group that's coming to our military college to discuss some responses to the coronavirus, some contingency planning. So I thought I would take this opportunity to talk about this impact as it pertains to strategic planning, operational alignment, leader development, and so forth. So I listened to a pretty good presentation by a professor from MIT, and it was on the subject of supply chain and contingency planning with versus the coronavirus, and he made the following points. First of all, is it really a pandemic? Yes, it is. So he made this kind of point that your strategic plan, if you haven't already made contingency plans, it's too late to start thinking about it now. And what he meant by contingency plans was some of the following considerations for the global supply chain. So the supply chain and supply chain theory really says that we can control or manage the environment sufficiently well that we can look for opportunities to find the most economic way of producing goods in the most efficient manner, taking into account some amount of insurance and transportation costs, local storage, and then some changing demographics like what's the prevailing wage rate in a region to produce a given thing over the life cycle, say the next 10 or 20 years. What do we expect that rising labor rate to be, and can we afford it, or do we have confidence in the projection of the rate of inflation of wages and raw materials and transportation costs? So if we can set all those things equal to manageable variables with a stable rate of change, then we can factor those projections into the total life cycle costs over the course of the project, and say, let's call it a 20-year forecast. Well, the supply chain management theory then causes you to drive out all the slack in a system, and you end up getting a very tightly coupled, closely regimented, linear process that is vulnerable to changes in the operating environment that go outside of the operating parameters that you've established. So if you thought you were going to have stable prices in oil, and you were building your business model on what you thought you could buy and sell oil for, and then suddenly there's a change that is 2 or 3 sigma outside of your expectations, now suddenly your entire business model is vulnerable to that kind of a change. When you multiply that across a global strategy, trying to get maximum efficiency by scaling it to the largest possible solution, you end up becoming vulnerable to many more variables than just local regional issues. And so the MIT professor was suggesting that guys needed to have had the following kinds of contingency plans already in place: alternate sources of supply, alternate supplies themselves, like if maybe this is coal, and maybe that different kind of coal, or different location of coal, different quality, different price points, different quantities, alternates for coal as an energy source, different contingencies for suppliers, like not just the raw material, but now the companies that have access to those raw materials that are acting as my broker. So we're going to have more than one company that can get after the raw material and then offset some of my company risk or currency risk. Different modes of transportation, alternatives to storage versus transportation. So if you can have reliable transportation, you can reduce your storage costs to zero because you are scheduling the arrival of supplies to coincide with when they're needed in the production line, and so you don't have to have any carrying costs for receive, store, and issue inventory of raw materials. You might have contingency plans where you can have a range of products that all are using the same pool of raw materials. So you can have, or even intermediate assemblies, so that I can have some contingencies about what it is I'm going to produce. You have contingencies about who I'm going to sell it to and at what price point and what quality point. You can have priorities in your customer base so that you can decide if you are encountering scarcity where you can't produce as much as there is for demand, that increased demand versus supply will enable you to drive the price up, and you can still cover your operating costs with selling fewer units but at a higher price because of demand. Well, then you will have to have had contingencies about who is going to be your preferred customers, and then you can have communication with them and have them pay a premium to get higher on your priority list, and now start locking in some prepayments to help you cover costs later on. You got to have contingencies for variations in your workforce. So imagine you were producing something around LA County. Well, there's 1.5 million kids going to school in LA County. What if there's a public policy decision that's made that sends all those kids home, and now 100,000 of your workers no longer can come to work because they got to stay home to take care of their 1.5 million kids? Well, what's your contingency as an alternate source of labor, and how are you going to account for that lack of production? And yet you're still going to have to pay those people, so your costs actually go up rather than down, and at the same time that you're producing less. So that can, the means of production get affected. What if your preferred regional manufacturer or assembler is no longer able to do things because that's where the pandemic is located, and you've got to relocate some of your assembly line to other regions, and you got to have contingencies for that. So if you're going to line up these different alternatives for sources of supply, labor, transportation, storage, raw materials, means of assembly, distribution, you've got to have those contracts in place at some cost, because if you waited till now to do that, all of that slack capacity is gone and been activated by people who already had the contracts in place. So you could actually have a side business in which you are selling some of your excess capacity or developing contingency capacity to be able to meet multiple needs from different competitors for your alternate means of production. So any of the strategic plans that we propose to put into place need to start taking into account very seriously the volatility of the environment that we're operating in. So I hinted a little bit at this last week, where we might call that VUCA considerations. Okay. So your contingency plans have to account for VUCA, the first one being volatility. So these are all sources of chaos and unexpected costs and things that you need contingency plans for. So volatility is the V of VUCA, uncertainty is the U, complexity is the C, and ambiguity is the A. So how are those different, you ask? Well, let's expand this so we can see it a little bit more easily. So volatility has to do with 4 rates of change. Oh, hi, Jingle. I'm sorry, I didn't see you come in. I had to go early, and I had to change to accelerate this last minute. So thanks for being able to jump in. So let me stop a moment and say hi. Yeah, so I would call it a contingency plan because it's not part of normal. If it's not part of the normal operating, but you're just reserving a capacity by paying some kind of premium, it's almost like an option that you can use or not. Like if I don't use the capacity, then I have to pay some kind of fee in order to preserve the opportunity. And but I don't pay the full price if I'm not actually using it. I would do that if the place where I have consolidated my production is so efficient that it saves me enough money to even pay for the insurance of not using the other capacity. Otherwise, I should just use both of those sources of supply and have the ability to scale, whether it's adding machines or adding a second shift with overtime or something like that. So volatility then, to get back to VUCA, volatility refers to the amount of change that's baked into the cake, into the environment, how much is changing, how fast can that change arrive? In other words, how soon could the steady state begin to change? And then how much does it change? How soon could it change? What is the duration of the change? So is this, if I'm going to see a 20% change in the operating environment, does that take a month for it to develop or a day? And I'll give you an example of that. The market this week experienced the most rapid 10% loss that it has ever experienced since the S&P 500 became a thing. That means it went from the all-time high at around 340 to 306 faster than it ever had before. So that not only is a magnitude of the change of 10%, but also the speed of the change in less than a week. And the amount of warning was about a day. And then how often do these sets of significant changes occur? Like, do I see a change like that only once a year, once a decade, once a century? Or do I see changes of that magnitude more frequently? So those are four different measurements of the rate of change in the operating environment. And then depending on how many variables you have in there, each one of the variables that affect that operating environment is subject to those four different measures of volatility. So the second large category of change is uncertainty. So uncertainty has to do with the probability of being right about my conclusion, how much I know or don't know. So let's suppose that if you had perfect knowledge of the environment, then you could say I was at 100% certain that the facts that I know to be facts are actually facts. Like there's no facts out there that are waiting to be discovered. I can say with confidence that I have certain knowledge that is legitimately true. All right, so uncertainty now gets to the point of saying, what percentage of all the facts that are there to be known do I actually know with some confidence? Now, those facts might have a shelf life, and so what was a fact today might not be a fact tomorrow. The changing in the nature of the fact is really more of the volatility rather than uncertainty. So uncertainty is just what is the total amount of information that can be known that I do know. So a good example of that is the strategic posture described by General Colin Powell, then later Secretary of State Colin Powell. And what he said was, when he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he said that in any given decision situation, on the scale between zero knowledge and 100% knowledge, that he could never afford to wait until he was 100% certain about all the facts to render his opinion on what to do, because he could not afford to lose the time waiting for that last percentage, going from 99 to 100, that the value of that last 1% of information was not worth waiting the extra time and cost that it would take to get to 100% certainty. And so he described generally three regions. He said there was a space between about 0 and 40% certainty when there was not enough information, even if valid, to have a reliable enough picture about what was emerging to take any kind of significant action. You might have put in some optional moves early, but you couldn't take decisive action until you got to about 40%. But if you waited till after 70%, there was a point of diminishing returns in which that each next incremental fact on the margin was not worth the loss of time and money for the amount of additional confidence that it gave you. So the reduction of uncertainty after 70% was really beyond the point of diminishing returns. But to go earlier than 40 was to go too soon, that you were making judgments on incomplete information. So he felt that somewhere between 40 and 70%, there was an artful judgment that he needed to apply to decide if he had enough information to start necessary movement early. And then he could wait for the rest of the information to start coming in so that he could refine his choices. But that around 40%, he already had a good enough read on the situation that he could start making some necessary moves. And now maybe that move is something that would be common to several different courses of action, but each of those courses of action both contained this particular task. Then he could start doing some of that early stuff often and get some of that in the bank already. So uncertainty then allows us to think about, when do we have enough information to begin making good enough decisions, and then learn to adapt and improvise as we go later. So volatility is the amount of change, frequency, scope, size, and cycle. And then uncertainty is that degree of confidence about completeness. So the third dimension of the VUCA construct is complexity. So complexity has to do with the number of variables that are significant in the operating environment. So let's suppose you were taking a look at a human being as an example of a system that has complexity. So if you just had one variable, maybe you might say male or female, and I'm not saying you should, but I'm just saying, suppose you had a very simplistic view of the world in which you decided that what you needed to know was whether or not that person was male or female, and from that you would base your judgment on what you were going to do. So that one variable in that case would be gender. So let's suppose you then said, give me a variable about age. And maybe I want to say young versus old. Or maybe I want to say in their 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 40. So and aggregating by decade. In some cases, it might be 5 years. In some cases, I might want to just say, are they in preschool, elementary school, middle school, junior high school, postgrad. So I might have different categories of time in which certain groupings of ages might make sense. So maybe I want to use a variable of employment or family status or ethnicity or country of origin or language spoken or numbers of language spoken or degree of education achieved or religious affiliation or maybe physical properties. So if I was trying to understand a human, I could even add their philosophical stance, their learning styles, their preferences for this or that, their risk aversion or risk embracement, their degree of entrepreneurial behavior, the number of jobs they have, the size of their family. You could quickly list about 40 or 50 different variables that you could use to measure different populations of humans. As you start adding variables, you are adding to complexity. Remember, those variables all themselves can be more or less complex depending on the number of different states of nature that each variable can hold. So when you start multiplying the numbers of variables times the number of positions in that variable, you start creating a number of different future states or possible future states. And then the mathematical computation of all possible future states becomes something like a measurement of the amount of complexity that's built into that system or that ecosystem simply on the basis of computational variability. So complexity as a measure of chaos or um, challenges in the world is the third dimension of VUCA. The fourth dimension is ambiguity. So ambiguity has to do with the number of different possible explanations that a given fact might be considered as evidence for. Right? So in the case of ambiguity, what you have is a condition in which the same fact that we agree is a fact, and which is 100% true and was measured, might actually support two different reasonable explanations. So the more facts that you have that support multiple possible conclusions or explanations, the more ambiguous the nature of that environment can be. Sometimes the facts that you have are mutually exclusive and that it will only support one or the other possible explanation. Sometimes, however, those in a world, in an ecosystem in which ambiguity is high, then I can't rule out some explanations simply on the basis of well-known facts. So those are four different measures of the challenges that we face with trying to understand the environment that we're operating in, or the system that we're trying to maximize, or the competition between different sets of actors and agents. So VUCA is a way for us to systematically evaluate the state of nature to determine what kind of a strategy do I need to account for all of the different combinations of possible futures. The more VUCA that there is, then the more robust my plan has to be to account for all of those different states of nature. So I have to build robustness, choice, adaptation in. If you have a very low VUCA environment, then you're actually facing a situation in which you can be very definitive and precise and stable and structured and controlled in the way that you develop your plan. You can have you can have an optimal strategy and then follow through with that. On the other hand, if you have high VUCA or high potential VUCA, then you have to account for those changes. So imagine you had spent the last 20 years developing your very efficient global supply chains, and you had figured out how to optimize your locations for manufacturing, and you discovered that suddenly this coronavirus has now upended, it has overturned all of those planning assumptions. And if you hadn't developed the contingency plans, you might really be in a world of hurt. So I want you to imagine the coronavirus as being nothing more than a scare. Maybe it's just a shadow. Even if it's just a threat that doesn't materialize, you could imagine how that could lead to a 20% slowdown in global economies, in the same way that the Transportation Security Administration has added costs and inefficiency to airport and railroad transportation, simply because of the extra expense that it takes to seek out and detect terrorists from having an effect. So even if there weren't any more terrorists, just the fact that it forced us to implement a TSA added a cost to the cost of doing business. So imagine what that is in the rest of the world now, as we start requiring our trading partners and nations begin demanding of their partners to have control measures at points of embarkation and debarkation to ensure that coronavirus and whatever follows after it isn't coming along with the shipment. So even without a real manifestation of a disease, the threat of the coronavirus could add as much as a 20% loss to global economic networks. We've already seen a 15% loss this week. Then if you start adding the actual damages of the coronavirus, the potential for 50 or 60% sell-offs in the market and in the reduction in trade is also there. The airline industries took a 10% hit just on Monday on the basis of projected losses of people traveling for vacations. Cruise lines and airlines get crushed early. Well, think of all the secondary and tertiary business sectors that are in support of those two prime industries. What what happens to them and their suppliers. So now you get this trickle down effect. So when you have a very tightly coupled global network with reinforcing feedback mechanisms, you can quickly get into what Taleb calls as the fourth quadrant problem. So I would encourage you to take a look at Taleb's fourth quadrant problem and his book on anti-fragile, which discusses how in the modern world with fat tail events being more and more commonplace, we have to design organizations to be able to withstand this kind of viral, scalable, global threats, and that anti-fragile is a design feature of organizations that must be considered. And so if you're going to design an organization to be anti-fragile, it comes with some additional costs, which are only good costs when and only when these different threats begin to materialize, and you can cover the costs of going for the anti-fragile solution. So people are starting to work their way through that right now with the coronavirus and the consequences of that. So again, imagine you're a manufacturer in the LA area and 100,000 of your workers are got to stay home to take care of their kids. Think of the loss of production that represents, not only in earnings to you, but to the downstream performance of everybody that's using your products and was counting on your
All right, everybody, it's me.
just-in-time inventory to drive their economic engines. So now this whole just-in-time engineering all the slack out of the supply chain and reducing inventory costs now starts looking like a unacceptable level of risk. So that's everything I wanted to say about VUCA and the coronavirus and some of those strategic contingency plans. So as you start looking at these different basic concepts that we use in strategic planning, operational alignment, leadership development, organizational development, take into account some of those changes that must be accounted for in the 5, 10, 15, 25-year time horizons and figure out some of the challenges we face in global markets. And that's some of the risks that you got to take on if you really propose to scale to global size. So that's everything I wanted to say about that. And now I have to head off to this next planning session. So, hey, thanks for hanging in there. If you got any questions about this, go ahead and send them me by email, and I can do a supplemental. We can continue this discussion in the discussion boards or in next week's live chat. So keep